Hi. In this video, we are going to take a look at the Vatican II Church's approval of non-Catholics receiving what is purported to be the Holy Eucharist. As you are probably aware, many conservatives in the Vatican II Church are very upset about Amoris Laetitia allowing for the divorced and remarried to receive Holy Communion. However, since most people are not aware that the Vatican II Church already allows for those outside the Church to receive the sacraments, this subject is of paramount importance. What we are witnessing today with communion for the divorced and remarried is simply the logical outcome of what we are going to be discussing in this video. To be clear, we do not believe that the Novus Ordo Church possesses a valid Eucharist in most cases, due to the new rite of episcopal consecration, and not to mention the new Mass is also at the very least doubtful. What we are addressing here is strictly the doctrinal error of allowing non-Catholics to receive this sacrament. Now, when we consider this issue of non-Catholics receiving Holy Communion, some people may stop and think, well, what's wrong with that? Don't we want people to receive Holy Communion? Or perhaps they may think that the reception of Holy Communion by non-Catholics only occurs under limited circumstances that the Church has always allowed, and that the Vatican II Church is consistent with this. Is that the case? As you will see, the difference between the Catholic teaching and that of the Vatican II Church is striking. In the 1917 Code of Canon Law, which was compiled under Pope St. Pius X and promulgated by Pope Benedict XV, we read the following in Canon 731. It is forbidden that the sacraments of the Church be ministered to heretics and schismatics, even if they ask for them and are in good faith, unless beforehand, rejecting their errors, they are reconciled with the Church. Why, we might ask, is this the law of the Catholic Church? In the book, The New Canon Law in its Practical Aspects, which consisted of papers published in the Ecclesiastical Review, we read the following in connection with Canon 731. Whereas the sacraments of the Church, instituted by Christ, are the principal means of sanctification and salvation, the greatest care is demanded in the timely and proper administration and reception of them. The question of whether or not there were exceptions for material heretics and schismatics in receiving sacraments under certain conditions was something discussed by many theologians before Vatican II. The following explanation is taken from Volume 1 of a practical commentary on the Code of Canon Law. The last sentence of Canon 731 is of far-reaching importance, and there is a great deal of controversy over the precise meaning of its ruling. In the first place, all canonists and moralists agree that those who are heretics or schismatics, and know that they are wrong, cannot be given the sacraments of the Church unless they renounce their errors and are reconciled with the Church. Numerous decrees of the Holy Office put this point beyond controversy. The controversy turns about those Christians who are separated from the Church in good faith. It is evident that the Church cannot, as a rule, allow the administration of the sacraments to non-Catholics. She would thereby prove false to her trust and deny her very principles. The Church, governed by the successor of St. Peter, is the only one Church authorized by Christ to teach the way of salvation and to distribute the means of salvation, the sacraments. The doors of the Church are open to all who are willing to live as the Church teaches, and those who will enter are entitled to all that the Church, by Christ's commission, can give them. But, with regard to those who stay outside in spite of the standing invitation, what business has the Church to minister to them the blessings which Christ commissioned her to give to his flock? Is there no exception to the rule forbidding the administration of the sacraments to baptize non-Catholics who are in good faith? In the case of those who are in good health, the prohibition is absolute. No dispute on this point is possible in view of the repeated, explicit declarations of the Holy Office. If they are in danger of death, it seems that the general rule stated in the Code may suffer an exception. The fact that the Code does not explicitly mention an exception to the rule is not necessarily an argument against the possibility of an exception, For in very many laws of the code no exception is stated, and yet, by a reasonable epikeia, exceptions are legitimate in a number of cases where unusual circumstances make the application of the law obnoxious. From a decision of the Holy Office, it is certain that the Church permits the administration of the sacraments to heretics and schismatics, provided that they are in good faith and have given at least a probable sign of that good faith, and provided scandal is avoided. In reference to those who have become unconscious, a declaration of the Holy Office stated that conditional absolution and extreme unction may be given if one can judge from the circumstances that the schismatic has at least implicitly rejected his errors. Scandal to Catholics present should be prevented by the declaration of the priest. The Church supposes that the person, in the last moments of consciousness, desired to return to the unity of the faith. One may therefore conclude that the Code does not state a new prohibition in Canon 731, and that the canonists and moralists who wrote on this question before the Code may be followed. The question is full of difficulties which seem to be beyond solution. It is very questionable whether the administration of the sacraments of penance and extreme unction, the two sacraments about which there is question in the case of non-Catholics in danger of death, does avail anything in many cases. The principal difficulty centers in the intention necessary for the valid reception of the sacraments. As most Protestants do not believe in the sacraments of penance and extreme unction, their case is not one of a mere lack of faith, but of positive rejection of the Catholic teaching on these sacraments. How, even when coupled with a general sorrow for their sins, a general will and intention to do all that God requires of them, is a sufficient intention to receive the sacraments, is difficult to understand, since the very foundation of an intention is lacking. Their frame of mind resolves itself, at most, into this: that they would want to receive these sacraments if they knew that they were sacraments, and if they knew that God wanted them to receive them. As actually they do not know or do not believe, it is difficult to understand how they can have a will or intention concerning something which they do not know or believe. There does not seem to be possible even an implied intention. The question is briefly summed up by Capello, Vermeersch-Kruisen, and Sabetti. A decree of the Holy Office reads as follows: whether approval may be given to the custom introduced in a certain hospital whereby dying heretics and schismatics are absolved conditionally on account of the presumed good faith of many who have been raised in heresy or schism, even though there has been no previous act by which they could be considered at least implicitly reconciled to the Catholic Church, and nothing has been said to them about reconciliation, either because this was impossible, or because the priest does not want to disturb the conscience of the dying non-Catholic. The answer was, the custom in question is to be condemned in the form in which it is explained. The intention of the sacred congregation is to inform the Patriarch of Jerusalem that whenever the dying heretic or schismatic has given some sign on which one can base a reasonable presumption that he adheres to the Holy Catholic Church, the priests may follow the rules laid down by recognized authors. Now that we've obtained a broader understanding of the Church's attitude and teaching regarding the administration of sacraments to non-Catholics in general, let's shift our focus in particular to Holy Communion. Father James King, in his work The Administration of the Sacraments to Dying Non-Catholics, states that the Blessed Eucharist, as is manifest from the history and the canons of the Code, is especially a sacrament of the external forum. They are to be repelled from the Holy Eucharist who are publicly unworthy. Such are excommunicated, interdicted, and those manifestly infamous, unless it is clear concerning their penitence and emendation, and they shall have repaired public scandal in the first place. Now the heretics and schismatics in question were in the state of heresy or schism, so that the Church does not renew public relationship with them until there is some definite sign given. Hence there can be no question of administrating the Blessed Eucharist, unless there is some form of external conversion or some clear sign. Father John Pra, in his work Communication of Non-Catholics and Catholic Religious Rites, provides us with a couple of extracts on the sanctity and symbolism of the Holy Eucharist. What is common to the other sacraments, writes the angelic doctor, must be attributed to it, the Blessed Eucharist, in a special manner, because of its preeminent dignity. One of its purposes is to unite the members of the mystical body of Christ, because by this sacrament men are gathered together in unity, and that is why it is called Holy Communion. In the words of Pope Pius XII, the sacrament of the Eucharist is itself a striking and wonderful figure of the unity of the Church. Father Pra goes on to say that when the World Council of Churches held its international meeting in August of 1954 at Evanston, Illinois, the question of Holy Communion was one of deep concern. Because of varying beliefs, communion services had to be held according to different rites. Holy Communion was offered to all the delegates in the Methodist Church and also in the Episcopal Church. The Lutheran Church offered Holy Communion to those who believed in the actual presence of Christ in the bread and wine, but the Greek Orthodox Church offered Holy Communion only to its own members. It appears that at similar reunion meetings held in Europe in recent years, non-Catholics had received Holy Communion at the Mass celebrated by a Catholic priest. According to two writers, this abuse recently prompted the Holy Office to issue the following prohibition: all communication in sacred things is entirely forbidden. A writer in the Commonweal reports the experience of a Catholic chaplain for German prisoners in Russia who was approached by evangelical Lutherans to allow them to participate in our Catholic liturgy and to receive Holy Communion at the Holy Saturday services. The chaplain examined the prisoners and found them to be baptized and believers in the real presence. They were familiar with confessing their sins and knew how to elicit an act of perfect contrition. It is sad to relate he permitted them to participate and to receive. One very important factor was missing. There was no abjuration of heresy, nor any reconciliation with the Catholic Church. Such action cannot be condoned, no matter how pitiful the circumstances. The chaplain allowed himself to be persuaded by sentiment to the detriment of sound theological reasoning. The demands of Canon 731 call for a rigid interpretation with regard to Holy Communion. Very much so, because the prisoners concerned were not in the danger of death. Manualists omit Holy Communion altogether in treating the question of administration of the sacraments to dying heretics. This silence has only one indication. Holy Communion may not be given to dying heretics. Certainly the unconscious are out of question. Their physical state alone is enough to forbid this irreverence, nor are exceptions to be made for conscious dying heretics. Father Pra concludes later on by referring to a couple of other theologians that held it might be permissible to administer Holy Communion in private to a dying schismatic in good faith, and believes that such a case would be extremely rare, especially since the sacrament cannot be given conditionally. For those in good health, an article published in Volume 13 of The Jurist, titled The Administration of the Sacraments to Dying Heretics and Schismatics, provides this summary of the Holy Office's teaching. It is not permitted to administer the sacraments to heretics and schismatics who are not in danger of death, unless they have first made an explicit abjuration of error and profession of faith. No exception is made for those in good faith, even when they expressly ask for them. So, let's review the conditions necessary for a priest to be able to administer the sacraments to a non-Catholic. Number 1, good faith. They must have the virtue of faith and be willing to believe everything that God has revealed, even though they are innocently mistaken about some of it. Number 2, at least implicit rejection of their errors. There had to be a visible sign of this. Number 3, the person had to be in danger of death. And number 4, scandal removed. Now that we know what the Catholic Church's teaching on this subject is, Let's look at the Vatican II Church. In the 1983 Code of Canon Law, promulgated by John Paul II, we read the following in Canon 844. Catholic ministers administer the sacraments of penance, Eucharist, and anointing of the sick licitly to members of Eastern churches which do not have full communion with the Catholic Church, if they seek such of their own accord and are properly disposed. This is also valid for members of other churches which, in the judgment of the Apostolic See, are in the same condition in regard to the sacraments as these Eastern churches. If the danger of death is present, or if, in the judgment of the diocesan bishop or conference of bishops, some other grave necessity urges it, Catholic ministers administer these same sacraments licitly also to other Christians, not having full communion with the Catholic Church, who cannot approach a minister of their own community, and who seek such on their own accord, provided that they manifest Catholic faith in respect to these sacraments, and are properly disposed. You will find essentially the same written in the official directory for the application of principles and norms on ecumenism, which was also approved of by John Paul II in 1993. This document also allows for giving communion to non-Catholics at mixed marriages. Because of problems concerning Eucharistic sharing, which may arise from the presence of non-Catholic witnesses and guests, a mixed marriage celebrated according to the Catholic form ordinarily takes place outside the Eucharistic liturgy. For a just cause, however, the diocesan bishop may permit the celebration of the Eucharist. In the latter case, the decision as to whether the non-Catholic party of the marriage may be admitted to Eucharistic communion is to be made in keeping with the general norms existing in the matter, both for the Eastern Christians and for other Christians, taking into account the particular situation of the reception of the sacrament of Christian marriage by two baptized Christians. So, why the change from the 1917 Code? In the book New Commentary on the Code of Canon Law, an entirely new and comprehensive commentary by canonists from North America and Europe, with a revised English translation of the Code commissioned by the Canon Law Society of America, we read, as a whole, the canon is the fruit of Vatican II's deliberations on ecumenism and replaces Canon 731 of the former Code. The latter contained an absolute prohibition of sacramental ministrations to heretics or schismatics, even those erring in good faith and asking for the sacraments, without prior reconciliation. Even under that canon, which admitted no exceptions in the text, it was understood that in danger of death, penance and anointing might be given conditionally in certain circumstances. In addition, Canon 1258 of the 1917 Code is abrogated by omission. It prohibited all active participation by Catholics in non-Catholic sacred rites. It tolerated passive or merely material presence under specified and limited conditions. Although the canon provides rather specific norms, the underlying principles remain those of Vatican II's decree on ecumenism, Unitatis Redintegratio. Notice how the purpose and motivation behind the change, as with practically everything since the 1960s, relates to Vatican II and ecumenism. Very important to keep in mind. In a work written by Father Francis Buckley on the principles of intercommunion, published in the early 1970s, the author provides us with some insight on what was occurring shortly after Vatican II in regard to Eucharistic sharing. The Dutch bishops decided to permit the non-Catholic partner of a mixed marriage to receive the Eucharist if he is baptized, desires the Eucharist, can accept the belief of the Catholic Church as it is expressed in the celebration of the Eucharist, and is admitted to communion in his own church. At the 1968 Eucharistic Congress in Bogota, Colombia, the Catholic hierarchy invited several non-Catholic clergy to receive the Eucharist, and in fact, an Anglican, two Methodists, a Lutheran, and a Presbyterian did receive. The rest had already left. The Roman Curia was displeased, but it is noteworthy that the Latin American bishops did not feel it necessary to consult Rome beforehand. Other Latin American and Asian bishops have permitted both intercommunion and concelebration under certain circumstances, but never as a normal and ordinary practice. The revolution was taking place swiftly. In fact, Buckley also remarks that many non Catholic Christians receive communion in Catholic churches each Sunday. In some large urban parishes, this figure may surpass 5% of the communicants. Catholics also, in smaller but ever increasing numbers, are crossing denominational lines to receive the Eucharist from their fellow Christians. It's also interesting to note that Father Buckley mentions the Roman Curia was displeased. One of the aspects of modernism that we have to keep in mind is that it's a belief system subject to change. And as you will see later, by the time of John Paul II, this type of action could happen without causing displeasure. Which, frankly, if there were any Catholics in the Roman Curia after Vatican II, they would have described it as a sacrilege. Now let's take a closer look at the Novus Ordo Church's law. The following explanation is provided to us by the Diocese of Rockville Center, New York, concerning Canon 844. The person requesting the sacrament must be validly baptized. Baptism is valid when water is poured or the person is immersed and the Trinitarian formula is used. For example, valid baptism is presumed for Episcopalians, Lutherans, Presbyterians, and Methodists. The person must manifest the faith which the Catholic Church professes in the sacrament. As a minimum for Eucharistic sharing, the person must believe that in receiving the Eucharist, we receive the body and blood of Christ. In some communions, this is standard dogma. For example, Episcopalians and Lutherans can be presumed to believe in the real presence. For members of other communions, there may be need for some further discussion concerning their belief in the Eucharist. The person must ask for the sacrament freely. The request must have been initiated by the person seeking Eucharistic communion. The person must be unable to have recourse for the sacrament to a minister of his or her own community. This condition is met when gaining access to one's own minister poses a reasonable physical, moral, or psychological difficulty, or causes serious inconvenience for the minister or recipient. The person must be properly disposed to receive the sacrament. As noted above, proper disposition is the same as required for Catholics, i.e. not conscious of serious sin, see Canon 916. Being properly disposed means being in a good relationship with God, or if not, taking whatever steps are necessary to return to a good relationship. Volume 3 of an exegetical commentary on the Code of Canon Law comments as follows. If they ask for them of their own accord, this condition has been interpreted by the doctrine in the sense that the minister must not take the initiative in suggesting, inviting, or persuading them, without taking into consideration the discipline of the Eastern churches for their own faithful, or using the sacraments or the circumstances of need as an instrument of proselytism. But beyond those concerns, it is fitting to think that the good of the souls and the need to participate in the grace may advise the Catholic minister to do everything within his power to make sure that those persons request the sacraments freely from their own ministers, and, in case of impossibility, from him. If they are properly disposed, in other words, assuming they believe correctly in the sacraments and fulfill the personal conditions that the Church demands from its faithful. All of this must be verified by the minister, who must also help the persons to prepare if they are not ready to receive the sacraments. In the case of the rest of the separated Christians, because there are greater doctrinal differences, other more severe conditions are required, in addition to the previous ones, in order to safeguard the principles set forth above for the correct communication in Sacris. The so-called more severe conditions are simply that the non-Catholic possess the Catholic belief in the Eucharist and that the individual be unable to approach their own minister. It is absolutely remarkable that they teach, it is fitting to think that the good of the souls and the need to participate in the grace may advise the Catholic minister to do everything within his power to make sure that those persons request the sacraments freely from their own ministers and in case of impossibility from him. What about doing all in your power to convert the person? Encouraging people in their false beliefs is so abhorrent to the Catholic mind, it makes one shudder. At any rate, what is the problem with the Novus Ordo Church's teaching here concerning communion? Not only has the requirement for danger of death been changed, which was considered an absolutely necessary and inflexible condition before Vatican II, but the non Catholic also no longer needs to convert to the Catholic religion. The Catholic faith isn't a requirement. Abjuration of error isn't a requirement. These people are allowed to stay in their false religion, and the priest isn't even supposed to try and convert them. In principle, there's really no reason why, in the future, the Vatican II Church could not adopt a policy of full-fledged sharing of communion. One of the most infamous instances of the Novus Ordo teaching in practice concerns Roger Schutz, a Protestant who founded an ecumenical monastery in France. During the funeral mass for John Paul II, Schutz received communion from then Cardinal Ratzinger. Walter Casper relates in an interview that was published in 2008. Brother Roger also received communion several times from the hands of Pope John Paul II, who had become friends with him from the days of the Second Vatican Council, and who was well acquainted with his personal journey with respect to the Catholic Church. In this sense, there was nothing secret or hidden in the attitude of the Catholic Church, neither at the ecumenical monastery or in Rome. During the funeral of Pope John Paul II, Cardinal Ratzinger only repeated what had already been done before him in St. Peter's Basilica, at the time of the late Pope. There was nothing new or premeditated in the Cardinal's act. Schutz, of course, did not convert to Catholicism before receiving communion. He remained head of the ecumenical monastery he founded until his death in 2005. In 2016, a group of Lutherans, after meeting with Francis, received communion from Novus Ordo priests in St. Peter's Basilica. Commenting on the event, the Lutheran bishop present remarked in an article published by Cotima, "This was not a coincidence either. This certainly reflects the new ecumenical attitude of the Vatican. The Pope was not at this Mass, but his agenda is to promote love and unity. He has many theological opponents in the Vatican, so it's hard to guess how much he can actually say, but he can make some decisions about the practice." You might be wondering how the Novus Ordo Church can allow for this sacrilegious practice. If you didn't watch the first and second video of this series, the following quote explains how this can logically happen. In the book Sharing the Eucharist, a theological evaluation of the post-conciliar legislation, Cardinal Johannes Willibrand states, "One outstanding achievement of the Vatican Council II has been a new understanding of the communio that exists among all the baptized. On the eve of the Council, official church documents regularly referred to the Christians of the Orthodox churches as schismatics, and to the members of the Reformed communities as belonging to heretical sects. During the Council, a new language emerged, signaling a change in understanding. Non-Catholic Christians were spoken of as separated brothers and sisters, and their assemblies were described as churches or ecclesial communities. This new way of thinking was the fruit of a new insight. The Council became increasingly aware that all who have been incorporated into Christ through baptism belong in a mysterious way to the Church of Christ. The Council also came to an appreciation of the presence of God's grace and saving power in the separated churches and communities. Some consequences followed from this new horizon. First, while the Council affirmed that the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church, it moved away from the opinion that there is an absolute and exclusive identity between the two. Second, the Council understood that there is an ecclesial saving value in the communions of non-Catholic Christians. Their members are not merely dispersed persons lost for the Catholic Church, to be converted individually. They are to be considered from within their respective churches or communities. With the Novus Ordo Church's belief that other so-called Christian religions belong to the true church, it makes sense that they would allow for their members to receive communion at least on occasion. Now that we've examined the Catholic Church's and the Vatican II Church's respective laws on communion for non Catholics, let's compare the summary we looked at earlier of the Catholic Church's requirements with that of the Vatican II Church. In the Catholic Church, for number one, good faith. They must have the virtue of faith and be willing to believe everything that God has revealed, even though they are innocently mistaken about some of it. In the Novus Ordo Church, needs to be practicing member of their religion. Catholic faith not needed. Number two, at least implicit rejection of their errors. There had to be a visible sign of this. In the Novus Ordo, no rejection of errors. Number three, the person had to be in danger of death. In the Novus Ordo, the person can be in good health. And lastly, number four, scandal had to be removed. In the Novus Ordo, scandal? There's no scandal here. What we have discussed in this video is one of the many evil fruits of the Second Vatican Council. So, do you now see the connection with Amoris Laetitia? The barrier, so to speak, of Catholic principles in regard to the administration of the sacraments had been broken decades before Francis even entered the scene. Remember, no matter who was in the Vatican dressed in white and claiming to be Pope, the Catholic Church will never lead people astray. Christ promised to be with his church until the end of time. Please wear the brown scapular and pray the rosary every day. Be truly devoted to our Blessed Mother, and she will take care of you. God bless you.